Yeah. So I'll just kick things off this morning. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you attending the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society's Southwest Regional Conference today. It's our second day of the conference, but yesterday was a great day. We hope that the same is going to happen today. I mean, there's several sessions going on throughout the day. Obviously, you have access to the conference and you can bounce around to the different sessions that you choose to. I will be moderating all of today's presentations that have to do with the conservation law enforcement officer presentations, I'm sorry. And my name is Robert Romero, by the way. I'm the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society's CLEO consultant. I've been here since 2020, the spring of 2020, and it's just been a great experience for me overall. Prior to that, I was working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and some of my prior colleagues are on today. I spent a number of years with the service, but I would like to just turn it over to Phil Land, who is the presenter this morning. And Phil is the special agent in charge of the Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement for the Southwest, and he's based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. So with that, Phil, I'll turn it all over to you.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. Been a challenging year for everybody, as we know, in the past year and a half, and I hope you and your families are safe out there. So going forward, and the things you do for conservation and law enforcement. Go through a presentation here, some PowerPoint slides, talk about overview of priorities with the Office of Law Enforcement. So again, as Rob said, Phil Land, Special Agent in Charge out here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Oversee 4 states, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Oklahoma. And I'll cover some of that as we go through some of these slides with everyone. I've been a federal officer going on 26 years now. 19 of those last with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So thank you again, the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, for letting us, me and the team, the other special agents hosting later today, talk about Office of Law Enforcement. As you see, slide 1, that's me, Phil Land. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Later, you'll hear from Agent Ruiz, Special Agent out in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Bobby Fortiz, Conservation Law Enforcement Officer, but now fixing to be a new Special Agent with us. And then Del Ivan Roper, who is located in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Kind of, we're going to talk about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to talk about the overview and priorities of our agency. Then we're going to Lacey Act, the Baldwin Golden Eagle Protection Act, evidence collection, security, and chain of custody, and case overview. One thing I always like to highlight is as far as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our mission. And starting out, he's talking about working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants in their habitats for the continued benefit of the American people. It reflects the value of the agency, places on working in partnerships with others. The service understands that the conservation of our nation is fish and wildlife. It's not something that it can achieve on its own. Strong partnerships with state and federal agencies, tribes, private landowners, and other stakeholders are integral in achieving conservation success. A lot of times we talk about this conserve, protect, enhance. And I think I always like to define a little bit of what those 3 priority words mean. So for conserve, harm or destruction, and that's dealing with culturally or environmental importance. Protection is formal or legal measures and using law enforcement in order to do that. And then enhance, which I think is very important, is improve the quality, value, or extent thereof. In other words, means to make something enhance is to flourish that and have that species, wildlife, or plants for future generations of Americans. So the Office of Law Enforcement mission is to protect wildlife and plant resources through the effective enforcement of federal laws. So by working with federal and state, tribal, and foreign enforcement agencies and other conservation partners, we fight wildlife trafficking, help recover endangered species, conserve migratory birds, preserve wildlife habitat, safeguard fisheries, and combat invasive species and promote international wildlife conservation. Talk about a little bit about our strategy, how we go about doing these, strategizing and priority of our work. Again, you can see the vision that we have, which just talks about the work with others. Again, the three important words there: conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants for the continued benefit of American people. And then our mission, which is the OLE mission, is effective enforcement of federal laws. And how do we do that? We do that by working with our federal, state, tribal, foreign enforcement agencies and other conservation partners to help recover endangered species, conserve migratory birds, preserve wildlife habitat, safeguard fisheries, combat invasive species, and promote international wildlife conservation. Our goals, which we try to achieve, every day, is combat wildlife trafficking, which is a very big one for us. And that's really selling for profit, people selling wildlife, plants, and species and making money unlawfully off of it. Protect the nation's fish, wildlife, and plants from unlawful exploitation, industrial hazards, and habitat. An example of that be Endangered Species Act, like Robert Fortiz does, our conservation officer out in Arizona, New Mexico, for the Mexican gray wolf, and then also like whooping cranes down in the south coastal valley of Texas. And also oil pits. A lot of birds, we find a lot of birds found left that don't have nets in oil pits out in, like, south, for example, West Texas, Southeast New Mexico. Third, facilitating and expediting legal trade, very important, and that deals with legal shipments and hunting trophies that our wildlife inspectors inspect every day coming through the major ports of entry throughout the U.S. And then lastly, enhanced management accountability is oversight of what we're doing every day in administration and our casework. And then our foundation is our people, good governance, and commitment to conservation. And I talk about this quite a bit here in this region, is our people we need to be there to assist them, and they're our greatest asset, because without people, you can't get anything done. Good government is talking about financial and budget, and then commitment to conservation is dedication and passion. I've never seen any other agency in my career of the people that work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are so dedicated and passionate about what we do. And then our focus is investigations, as 1811s for the government and for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is enforcing those federal wildlife, criminal, other statutes, which I'll cover here shortly. The regulation is compliance. We really want people to comply with the laws that are out there. Education is dealing with outreach at schools, non-government organizations like Audubon and other law enforcement agencies. We routinely do presentations for U.S. Customs Border Protection, U.S. Border Patrol, anyone that comes to us, always trying to get our mission and vision out to other law enforcement organizations and our non-government partners. Partnerships, which I've always seen as very vital to our success of our investigations and for the service, is working with our Native American tribes, our state and local and federal law enforcement agencies, again, our non-government organizations. An example like today, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. And lastly, protection is, defining like what is the most important. And for us, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we always look at those federal trust species that are out there. What is threatened and endangered? The bald eagle, the golden eagle, certain federal trusted species that we're entrusted to protect. And going back a little bit, that I always say here in this region is our vision also is always, we want to be the best trained, best equipped, and best detectives for the resource. We do want to be the best at what we do. And then lastly, a little bit more about protection is, and I talked to the special agents in our region about this, is when we're looking at investigations, we're looking at what is the damage to the resource. How many people are doing the illegal activity, or how many businesses are involved in it, and the amount of money being made off of it. And lastly, why is it important? Why is it important to, for example, New Mexico Game and Fish? Why do they come to us for our help to protect a state listed species that someone might be poaching, trafficking, moving to Oklahoma or Arizona, dealing with the Lacey Act, which one of my fellow colleagues will go into later. So that's the kind of things we look at in investigations. And why is it important to a certain Native American tribe that we might not be aware of, but it's important that we could educate and tell the U.S. Attorney's Office is why we're bringing this case to them. Again, a little bit of focus areas. That was number 5 on the strategy list I just mentioned. Kind of highlights the goals again, kind of puts it in a more focused manner as you see it. Again, I believe our number 1 priority is combating global wildlife trafficking and the sale of any plant or wildlife out there, and protecting the nation's fish and wildlife and plants from unlawful exploitation, industrial hazards, and habitat loss. Facilitate and expedite the legal trade, and enhance management accountability. And we can't do that without that larger circle as everyone sees there. Investigating, forcing regulation, educating, partnerships, and protection. Kind of at a glance, I just wanted to cover a lot of the different positions and the groups that we have within OLE. So first you see the special agent attaches, then our special agents, wildlife inspectors, National Eagle Wildlife Property Repositories, the Wildlife Intel Unit, the National Fish and Wildlife Forensics Lab, and the Digital Evidence and Technical Surveillance Unit. So you can see there, the first one there, as we mentioned, is the special agent attaches. You see they're stationed at a U.S. embassy in strategic regions that are, both wildlife, that have wildlife and wildlife crime, to strengthen international partnerships for poaching and illegal trade. This has happened probably in the last 8-9 years or so that we've had attaches, and we have them stationed in South America, Africa, I believe now, and out in Asia. Our program is really enhanced from a domestic operation to an international operation, and taking U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our Office of Law Enforcement globally. So they really routinely work on gathering intelligence and coordinating international investigations, focus on crimes that have a nexus, and provide training to build capacity with international law enforcement partners and leverage U.S. government assets to enhance law enforcement efforts. And lastly, provide access to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service scientific resources, such as the National Fish and Wildlife Forensics Lab and the DIRTSU, Digital Evidence Recovery Unit. And you also do a lot of international training, where agents will go, like myself. I went to Africa a couple years ago, and I was in Africa for around 3 weeks and did training in that country, in Botswana. So there's opportunities for our folks to go on some international assignments and do training, which meets our vision and our strategic goals of Office of Law Enforcement. Of course, and then we have special agents here in the United States, and they break up international domestic wildlife trafficking rings that target protected animals and parts. As I mentioned in our goals, protecting wildlife from environmental contaminants, industrial hazards like oil pits, wind farms, and turbines, and electrocutions on electric poles. That we work with industry on that. Habitat for threatened and endangered species. We work with several of our partners, different programs within the service, like Ecological Services, Division of Refuge Law Enforcement, in order to make that happen. They enforce the migratory game bird hunting regulations. We still work a lot of that with the states. For hunting regulations, and it's more compliance. People that have unplanned shotguns shooting over limits of birds that they shouldn't be taking. So we routinely go out and put operations together with our state partners, our state and federal tribal partners, to do that. Other combating global wildlife trafficking, transnational organized crime, which is becoming a bigger thing across the U.S. and globally. We're seeing wildlife crime with all different crimes that we're seeing throughout the U.S. From now, I'm getting involved in mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. You'll see some of that in some of the slides I have coming up. Part of it is also, like today, training and doing presentations for our federal, state, tribal, and foreign law enforcement officers, and conducting outreach to industry and trade groups to promote wildlife conservation and secure that voluntary compliance of what we're looking for. We also have uniformed wildlife inspectors, and they're stationed at airports, ocean ports, and border crossings. So they inspect wildlife shipments to ensure compliance with wildlife laws and detect illegal trade. They prevent the introduction and interstate spread of injurious species. Of course, work with our counterparts at U.S. Customs, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Department of Ag, to maintain controls of interdict smuggled wildlife, and conduct inspections at international mail facilities and passenger terminals at airports. And you'll see some of that, how people get creative to smuggle in wildlife. It's kind of crazy, but people do anything to bring in some of this wildlife from foreign countries because they can make money off of it. And then we also have a canine unit. So we use canines to detect greater number of legal shipments and wildlife products that can lead to further investigations for arrest and prosecution. And then we have the National Eagle Wildlife Property Repositories. And it's up in an area of Denver, Colorado, but provide a central location for the receipt, storage, and distribution of bald and golden eagles and their parts. I have a lot of staff there that ship eagles and parts to enrolled Native Americans for use in religious and cultural ceremonies. And they receive wildlife items that have been forfeited or abandoned, and they donate wildlife for scientific and educational purposes, also facilitating the science and biology behind what we do to help further that. We do have a wildlife intel unit, and there's some special agents and intel analysts that are back at headquarters in Falls Church, Virginia. And our agents and inspectors will work with them to identify and disrupt wildlife trafficking networks, criminal syndicates. And what a lot of these folks do is they collect and analyze the information and all aspects of wildlife trafficking to support investigation, inspections, and smuggling interdiction efforts, and coordinate information sharing with other law enforcement agencies in the U.S. and around the world, and maintain a broad network of domestic international contacts with conservation groups, trade associations, and other entities involved concerned in wildlife trade. And always looked at our wildlife unit as a more of an intel-led policing, is they can help us decide what's coming in, where it's coming in, how it's coming in, and we can adapt to some of that and where we need to put resources at a certain time, a time of year, a certain day. And so intelligence can drive some of the policing and conservation that we do. The National Fish and Wildlife Forensics Lab, it's the only lab in the world dedicated to fight crimes against wildlife. And it's in Ashland, Oregon, in Southern Oregon. you haven't ever been there, you know, it's a great opportunity to go see what they do there and how they do it. But they identify species and subspecies and pieces and parts and products of an animal, and determine the cause of death of an animal, and help our wildlife officers determine about if a violation has occurred. And they can compare physical evidence in an attempt to link suspect, victim, and crime in the crime scene, just like a regular police department would at their crime lab. The science, they can put the science behind to help us make our investigation. And then lastly, we do have a digital evidence recovery technical surveillance unit. It consists of 2 programs, a digital forensics lab and a covert electronic surveillance equipment unit. It provides multi-layered expertise, both technical and investigative, to assist our field officers with large-scale and complex investigations of wildlife crime by retrieving, analyzing computer-based records and advanced surveillance techniques. As we know, more people are using technology to enhance their unlawful crimes they're doing out there. And we need professionals that have that expertise, and they can help us do that. And most of the statutes that we enforced, of course, is the Lacey Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Migratory Bird Hunting and Conservation Stamp Act, Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, Endangered Species Act. And those are some of our bigger ones, those first ones you see right there. More importantly, Lacey Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Endangered Species Act, Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Every once in a while, get into Wild Bird Conservation Act with import exports, Rhino Tiger Conservation Act, people using medicinals and bringing stuff in, ports of entry or border ports, African Elephant Conservation Act, Fish and Wildlife Recreation Act, dealing with crimes on fish hatcheries, for example, fish and wildlife lands, our National Wildlife Refuge System Administration Act, which is the Division of Refuges and Refuge Law Enforcement. We do have federal wildlife officers that are uniformed officers that patrol and protect our refuges out there. And we work hand in hand with them on different things. If crimes come on a refuge, and the crimes are on the refuge, but for some reason someone's poaching or something goes in a refuge, and that crime is taken off that refuge, then we'll work with our federal wildlife officers. Archaeological Resources Protection Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act. Marine Mammal Protection Act, of course, is very big up in Alaska. And then lastly, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which back in 2012, we signed a memorandum of agreement to enforce, and I'll go into that a little bit more later here in my presentation, is to enforce the act. And we have a group of dedicated agents to do that. And I know later in some of the other presentations, we're going to talk about the Lacey Act and Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And that's one we see a lot with working with our law enforcement partners on with Native American tribes. Kind of our organizational structure, you'll see there is our assistant director was our chief for Office of Law Enforcement, is in Falls Church, Virginia. Underneath him is our deputy assistant director. And then we have the forensics lab that I mentioned earlier. And then we have a professional responsibility unit that all report directly to the director, assistant director for OLE. This key, you kind of see where it's broken down of how the regions report to our headquarters office. There's each regional SAC, Special Agent in Charge, which I sit there. You see that SAC region number 2. That I'd be right here. But as you break down the regions, we have eight region and 8 regional Special Agent in Charge. An example would be here, number 1 there, and the SAC there is in Portland, Oregon. It has Assistant Special Agent in Charge, support staff that assist the SAC and ASAC. Then what we call a first line supervisor, resident agent in charge. And I'll go into a map a little bit later for our region and show you the resident agent in charge offices. They have support assistants. We can't do our job without the admin staff, as everybody knows. And there are special agents, supervisory wildlife inspectors, which are the supervisors for the wildlife inspectors, and then the wildlife inspectors, kind of how it's broken down. Here, you know, I sit here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Region 3 is up by Minneapolis, Minnesota. Region 4 is Atlanta. Region 5 is in Hadley, Massachusetts. Region 6 is in Lakewood, up by Denver. That's also where the repository is located. Region 7 is in Anchorage, Alaska, and Region 8 is in Sacramento, California. I'll show everybody a little map a little bit later, kind of shows all of that. We do have a special agent in charge of Special Operations Division, a special agent in charge at headquarters, and then a technical and field support staff. And under our SOD, we have Special Investigations Unit, which I'll talk a little bit more about that here coming up in a few slides. Special in charge that is in charge of the Intelligence Unit, which I spoke about earlier. We have a special in charge of International Operations, which oversees the attaches. And we have a special in charge of training and inspection. And lastly, a special agent in charge of our digital evidence technical unit. So here that I'm responsible for here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, our SAC office, we have about 53 employees, 22 special agents, with 5 of them assigned to the Indian Arts and Crafts Board unit, 21 wildlife inspectors, 8 administrative personnel, 1 conservation law enforcement officer. And with that, we have 18 law enforcement offices, 5 border inspections stations, and 2 law enforcement designated ports of entry. You can see the southwest border is huge. Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas shares over 1,650 miles of the border with Mexico. So our region, those 4 states, it goes from, I always say, from Brownsville, Texas to Yuma, Arizona, and large geographical area for about 53 employees. You can see down here at the bottom, we have the some highlights. If you're interested to see kind of what the Southwest Law Enforcement or Southwest region does, you could click on that. And a lot of our cases that we make, not only this region, but nationally, you can find on the FWS.gov.le at those 2 links. Kind of what our special agents do. Plainclothes criminal investigators. There's approximately 223 of us worldwide. They do overt and undercover investigations. You know, of course, overt would be going out there and, you know, maybe checking dove hunters for being in compliance, or duck hunters, that kind of thing. Transnational organized crime, wildlife trafficking investigations, and endangered species investigations. And kind of the transnational organized crime is looking at the criminal networks. There's a lot going on. If there's, you know, attaches in Africa, identifying certain things of trafficking a certain species and how they're bringing it in. I mean, we have wildlife associated now with, you know, firearms trafficking, human smuggling, intellectual property theft, cyber crime, and that all affects, transnational organized crime affects the public safety, of course, and economic security of the government. So we're always trying to identify if there is more going on just in one person or one business, or is it a group of individuals doing things that's detrimental to the resource. You see a couple photos there. Teamwork going on, pre-planning, probably before a search warrant. To talk about, you know, the operations of the case. We do that quite a bit here before we do search warrants and arrest warrants. And mostly it's, you know, threats and things to be looking out for our personnel and our safety. An agent there doing some inspections. It's like a seizure, some rhino horns there, as everybody can tell. And then a subject being arrested, probably for some one of our guys doing arrests for some wildlife crimes. So special agent office locations. You see there's several around the country, as I mentioned, different parts of the regions and how they're broken up, but we're here in region 2 for the Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. In our first line, I'm going to go back to talking about our resident agent in charge. Their first line supervisors out in the field. We have one in Fort Worth, Texas. He presently oversees Oklahoma and the Northern District of Texas. We have a resident agent in charge in Houston, Texas, and he presently oversees the Southern District of Texas, which covers half of Texas all the way to El Paso, including the border in this area. And we have an agent down in McAllen. We have an agent in El Paso. We have a couple agents in San Antonio, a few agents with the RAC there in Houston, a few agents in Fort Worth, one agent in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was Oklahoma City, but he is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then you move over here to the west part of our region. We have New Mexico and Arizona. Presently, the resident in charge is Misty Lakota. She's on a detail presently with the BIA. Acting supervisors on here with us, Dale Ivan-Groper. And presently Dale is overseeing New Mexico and Arizona operations. And he's in Las Cruces, but our RAC office is in Albuquerque. And then we have an office in Rio Rico, Arizona, and then one Chandler, Arizona, in Phoenix. So. And of course, you can see some of the other regions, how they're laid out in the Northwest and Sacramento, Portland, as I mentioned. And our main office there, headquarters, is in Falls Church, Virginia. In Alaska, you can see Alaska down at the bottom. Domestic investigations, I mean, this just kind of highlights some cases and seizures that you'll see there. Put this slide in there to show you some of the seizures and things that we've worked on and done over the years. But most important, the hot commodities right now is reptiles and birds, in particular turtles. People like turtles, and there's a lot of poaching, a lot of trafficking going on with turtles. And invasives, we recently had a snakehead case of bringing people trying to smuggle in invasives to do detriment to the habitat destruction of our conservation efforts. And that can, as we know, that can decimate a population. So really looking at invasives and things coming into the country. Through our import and exports, our wildlife inspectors are looking at that, interdicting that kind of stuff. It's kind of a shipment here that was broken open and looking at, and those are turtles and socks, for example. And then tanks, you really go in to do search warrants, and different species are in containers or they're in fish tanks, like you see there, a reptile tank, similar to stuff like that. Just large shipments. These shipments is a lot of work for an inspector to go through and break open all these boxes. So it's nice to have a canine team that we can be a canine that can scent on certain things that they're looking for to identify some of these shipments. International investigations, we talked about that a little bit with our attaché program, and our agents in domestically work with our attachés in different countries. Like that's a penguin there, as you can see, and this was a case, Operation Crash, which is a pretty well-known case of rhinos and trafficking rhino horns and cutting the horns off and selling them for profit. And one of the seizures that the agents made a while back of seizing money and the horns. You can see the rhino horn here with the horn actually cut off. Mentioned some of the turtles here. Turtles is big right now in trafficking. Always say, our state and tribal officers out there that, if you ever stop someone, you see someone with a whole bunch of turtles in the back of their truck, there may be something more going on there of where they're taking those turtles. And not for personal consumption, but they're looking at taking them back and trafficking them, selling them, putting them in socks, sending them out to international places. So, and of course, if anyone, on the call today on this presentation, anybody can reach out to one of our special agents and, for assistance or, reference the Lacey Act or some of the laws that we do enforce. Our Special Investigations Unit, it's OLE's Major Crimes Unit, focused on criminal organizations having the greatest and far-reaching negative impact on wildlife resources. And then our Senior Special Agent stations strategically across the country. So they'll could be in different parts of our regions. Like I showed everyone the regional map, they could be stationed in some of those areas in the regions. So they could work directly with some of our agents that are within that region, and they're looking at a lot of mentioned the most damage being done to the resource and those individuals of business making the most money off illegal profit of wildlife. Indian Arts and Crafts Board unit, we do have a resident agent in charge for that unit and oversees presently 5 agents in that unit. A couple here in New Mexico, one in Arizona, and then one in Anchorage, Alaska. A lot of territory to cover, but they've done an outstanding job to investigate some of this counterfeiting schemes. So you can see there what they focus in on is 18 U.S.C. 1159, misrepresentation of any produced goods and products, the ACCA. We're also seeing a lot more other federal statutes we're getting involved in, mail fraud, wire fraud, smuggling goods in the United States, money laundering, aggravated identity theft. We see that a lot with our wildlife crimes as well. It's not just a wildlife crime. Now we're seeing different things and how people are committing some of these crimes by using the mail system or wiring the money for their illegal activities, smuggling in at different border ports or airports. Our RICB unit secured its first ever multi-felony conspiracy conviction under the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. This wasn't too long ago, about a year ago or a year and a half ago. And we've achieved seven felony convictions that included violations such as conspiracy for wire fraud, mail fraud, entry of goods by means of false statements, smuggling goods into the United States. We've received hundreds of thousands of fines, restitution, and forfeiture, and over 200,000 pieces of counterfeit Native American style jewelry that was seized or removed from the marketplace. So our main focus is just not on the street dealers, but of course we're looking at retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers, counterfeiters, smugglers who are violating the Lacey Act. That's my phone going off there. So very proud of this unit. They've made a lot of headway, couple of things that I just want to highlight real quick since the Fish and Wildlife Service has been working with Indian Arts and Crafts Board is, we had the largest prison sentence ever for our ACCA, which is 6 months in prison, secured a $300,000 fine to the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, and of course seized assets that were in our bank, almost $300,000. And of course, the first ever multi-felony conspiracy conviction. So that unit does exceptional work and very proud of it. Conservation law enforcement officers, we do have CLEOs within OLE. Presently, we have three is in Bobby Fortiz, which I mentioned earlier is going to become a special agent with us. But they are, and then we have 2 down in Florida that protect the manatees, so the manatee speed zone enforcement, and then Bobby works out there with the Mexican Gray Wolf program to protect our wolves. They do a lot of, like Bobby does a lot of uniform officer presence, patrol, outreach, education, He assists our special agents when needed. And I know he's going to do a presentation. I don't want to steal his thunder, his highlights, so he'll talk more about what he does. But I always see it as a deterrence for crime and working a lot of ESA type cases and working with our state and tribal partners out there. You can see some of the federal enforcement partners that we do work with. Just to highlight some of them with the OJ, our special agents work quite a bit with assistant U.S. attorneys to present cases. Now drug trafficking with DEA, FBI has always assisted us if we need their assistance on cases and investigations for personnel and support staff. NOAA, and then of course ICE, Homeland Security, Customs, Border Protection. And then lively discussion or questions. That makes a great wolf picture there for us, but yeah, that's a priority strategic for Office of Law Enforcement. If anybody has any questions, we're going to answer those questions. And I know some of the agents and Bobby and our CLEO and are on this meeting and presentation as well. So first, I hope everybody enjoy the presentation. It's always nice to work with our partners out there and highlight who we are, what we're about, and how we do business. Got a lot of great people out there doing great things for conservation. So we can't do it without everybody else. So
Appreciate it, Phil.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I'll just kind of open it up for any questions. I have not received any in the chat, but for those of you that do want to ask questions directly, go ahead and unmute your mic, and the floor is yours to open the discussion. We've got 15 minutes. Anyone? Phil, let me just ask one to start a little discussion.
Yeah.
A lot of the statutes, obviously having worked with the agency before, deal with a lot of non-native species. Obviously, that's a priority mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But when it comes down to Indian country, what types of investigations does OLE historically work with the tribes, and how would those tribal officers initiate some of those cases in partnership with the service?
Yeah, Rob, that's a good question. So a lot of I would say some of the cases we see involved, could be like the Lacey Act or the Migratory Bird or Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Could be non-native coming on Native American lands, doing poaching of an elk, and then moving that carcass to somewhere, off those tribal lands to, to another state or another area. Then we would get involved with something like that. Could be trafficking of bald and golden eagle feathers or talons thereof, or something detrimental to, which I always say that's important to the Native American tribes, that's important to them that we might not be aware of, that if they call one of our special agents, as you mentioned, just takes a phone call, that something that's interesting that we need to look at. We've worked with several of the tribes out here in the West, that if they have what they think is a violation, that they know, first where our offices are located and where they can get a hold of an agent. If they feel like that there's a crime that's been committed and something's been taken off that tribal land that we can enforce, because the Lacey Act gives us authority to do that. The crime's been committed, on those tribal lands, and it's a wildlife that's taken in violation, and I know Dale Ivan's going to go into that a little bit more later, then we can look at that. And then we take that and, you know, to the U.S. Attorney's office, and they usually sign an assistant U.S. attorney to it. And a lot of times they do have assistant U.S. attorneys that will work certain crimes on Native American lands that we'll work with. So hope that answers some of your question.
Yes, it did. Thanks for sharing. And I raise that because I know that we've got, you know, some officers here potentially on the phone, on the line here, but hopefully they'll continue with the presentations throughout the day, because I think you're right. I mean, there's specific Lacey Act issues that some of the other presenters are going to deal with, Bald Golden Eagle, you know, situations, and even evidentiary issues or presentations that I think all tie this in back to Indian country, and just the ability to share information and partner up with the service, you know, just to try to get these things prosecuted for the benefit of the wildlife, of course, but obviously for the tribal communities, which is.
And that's a big thing, as you mentioned, Rob, is communication. I always see that as a very important asset for everybody is you got to communicate. And if you see something that you think could be, you know, based on your knowledge, experience, and training out there as you're doing your conservation law enforcement, and then be able to pick up the phone and know who to call. And then we go from there and try to work together to get it resolved. So
Absolutely.
and we might not know, you know, some of the importance of a particular case, and that's where it comes in. It's like, you know, we have, as I went over some of our goals and our visions and strategic priorities of what we do, is, you know, that they come to the forefront, that it's always helpful if you go into a U.S. Attorney's office and you know from your experiences that you go in there as a team and say, you know, this is Fish and Wildlife presenting this, but this is why this is important to Hopi Nation. And this is what we need to make sure the U.S. Attorney or the prosecutor knows why this is important and why we're bringing it to them. So, and you know, there's a lot of you know, a lot of cases out there with, you know, that U.S. Attorney's office do see, you know, from you know, the drug trafficking to the felons in possession. You know, but they've been very receptive to us out here in the West in some of our wildlife cases. And I think the environment and wildlife, you know, is very important. So I think we've been fortunate with some of our successful prosecutions that we have had.
Absolutely.